Welcome, everybody. This is the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley, and every week we bring you the stories of people who make a difference in the lives of others around the world, globally, locally, and digitally. And our club, the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley, is one of many, over 36,000 clubs around the world with over 1 million Rotarians and Rotaractors who all work under the motto, service above self. The idea is that you bring a bunch of cool people together and have them come up with ideas for cool projects, and you just make good things happen for others. In that space, as a part of my work at Junipero Serra High School in San Mateo, California, I was very fortunate to meet one of its proud grads, Michael Collopy. Michael is a portrait photographer, a photojournalist, and has had the chance to talk with people all over the world, many of whom are, say, world leaders and luminaries in their fields. And he has recently come out with a new book. That book is called Courage. And I am excited for him to tell us about what he has learned from those interactions that he has had with the different people he's photographed. And so, Michael, we are so proud to have you as part of our program today. Welcome to the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley. I hand the mic over to you.
Thank you so much, Rushton. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be with all of you. So I'll tell you a little bit about how I got started. I went to Serra High School in San Mateo, as Rushton said, and grew up on the peninsula in Burlingame. Both of my parents were artists, and I thought that that's where my goal was going to go. I was going to follow that vocation to be an artist, or a graphic designer, an art director, as my father was. And I went throughout school and graduated at St. Mary's College with a fine art degree specializing in graphic design. Coming out of school, I realized that there were no real creative jobs available to a new graduate. So I ended up at that time being very disappointed and dismayed that I went through all this schooling. And this was before the computer industry kind of took over in our business. And I felt like, all this education, I wasn't going anywhere. I'd never taken photography in school, but I ended up seeing an exhibit of Ansel Adams' work. Many of you may be familiar with Ansel Adams, the great environmental photographer, lived in Carmel Valley. And one of the docents said, as I looked incredibly inspired by his pictures, the scale, the sense of detail in his black and white images, and I was just blown away. And it was really kind of an epiphany moment for me. I had never taken photography in school, as I said, and I ended up hearing from one of the docents that Ansel lived in Carmel Valley, which was pretty close to me. So, of course, that next Monday, I ended up calling 411 information up for a listing on Ansel Adams. Sure enough, he was listed. I went down to his house, and he ended up inviting me in, and I learned photography in the very early years through Ansel Adams, being in his darkroom and learning a lot about his technique. One of the amazing things that he taught me, which I think applies to everyone, especially business leaders, is that sense of pre-visualization. So in other words, in our case, as a photographer, visualizing that final portrait or the final picture before you even meet that individual. And I think for business, in terms of recognizing or seeing yourself going forward in a very successful business with successful people behind you, is almost like a spiritual thing, but it was a very important element that I think I oftentimes look back on with a lot of high regard. These are some pictures that I had taken of Ansel in those early years. I realized after spending a couple of years with Ansel that there was no way I was going to make a living as an environmental photographer. I had always been interested in people. So I ended up saving my money and going out to New York to meet Richard Avedon, who was the great fashion and portrait photographer at the time. And it wasn't as easy as just picking up the phone with Ansel Adams. I ended up going back to his studio, I think, for every day for the following 2 weeks before they gave me an opportunity to meet with him face to face. But that was really the inspiring moment that I needed to go forward and to build a portfolio of individuals that I could seek out work. And one of my first jobs was at the old Circle Star Theater in San Carlos. I don't know how many of you might be familiar with that. But when I was 20, shortly after high school, I was able to meet Frank Sinatra. And then maybe about 7 years later, after I was working there for a few years, I ignited that friendship with Sinatra. He ended up hiring me, and he was really my first conduit to my first big client. And he ended up introducing me to a lot of his friends, and that really set me off on my course of being a portrait photographer for the last 46 years. And I have to say, these are, I'm going to stop and divert for just a moment, because one time at Sinatra's house in Palm Springs, he had told me about his arrest record when he was 22 years old. And so he happened to have the original arrest record. So I was able to photograph it. Now, many of you may have seen this original picture of that's been duplicated all over the place, but you may not have seen the back of it, which offers the reason why he was arrested for seduction at the age of 22. So apparently the apple didn't fall far from the tree. But he was a great man and a wonderful first client, and it led me on to photographing a lot of entertainers. He introduced me to Quincy Jones. I ended up working with Quincy for about a year, working on his illustrated memoir book, and Paul McCartney, just a wide variety of performers and entertainers in all kinds of different fields. I started out working with musicians, and I ended up working with a lot of actresses and actors and entertainers over the years. I always had an interest in seeking out those who were changing the world, however. And it goes back to my years at Sarah High School, where I was shown a movie on the work of Mother Teresa of Calcutta before she was famous. And this even goes back further, because as a 10-year-old, my folks were very much Robert Kennedy supporters when he was running for president. So they brought us as a family to meet him when he was going to make a speech, I believe in San Jose. And I remember that day vividly, shaking his hand, noticing the details of his face, that he was going a little bit gray on the sides of his head, of his hair, and just his captivating presence. He had a way of connecting with people, a great sense of humor. And there were all kinds of individuals trying to reach out and pull off the buttons of his coat. I noticed that there was a bodyguard holding his ankles down so that he wouldn't fall out of the open air car that he was in. And it just made a big impression on me that here was an individual who was serving others. And it was 2 months after that he was assassinated. And that really made a big impression on me as a 10-year-old, because I thought, whatever I end up doing in my life, I want to try to give back to others in some way. And as Rushton said, that I have been working as a portrait photographer. I've been able to photograph the last 7 presidents, countless heads of state. I ended up photographing very early in my career and documenting the Nobel Peace Laureates, and I'm up to about 41 of those individuals. And I would say that, with all of those individuals, especially leaders that I came across, there were some common threads that I think we all can learn from. And many of these things are things that we know and quite simplistic. The common thread that I would say links a lot of these leaders and individuals that I came across was that sense of humility and boundless dedication to other people. And this is John Lewis, of course, who I spent a lot of time with. And one of the days that I was with him, he spent a couple hours with me talking about the civil rights movement and his position there. And he had a sign in his office that I'll never forget. It said, the people who pick cotton will one day pick our next president. And certainly John Lewis had a big responsibility and was quite influential in getting Barack Obama elected during that time. And, he told me that he always focused on his particular faith growing up and had that dictate his whole life. And he said that when the civil rights movement started to become more violent, he realized that he couldn't stay involved with the civil rights movement. So he ended up getting involved with Bobby Kennedy's campaign. And so he ended up, traveling to Los Angeles, going door to door with the likes of Cesar Chavez and others to try to get Bobby Kennedy elected. And he was with Bobby Kennedy on the night that he was killed. And he remembers flying back from that day, just crying flying over the mountains back to Atlanta and realizing that there was still snow in the mountains in June, which was unusual at the time, but it typified his particular mood. And I would say that when he landed, he realized that this was the opportunity that he had to start running for office and to try to attempt to serve other people as Bobby Kennedy did. So it made quite an impression on him. But a lot of these individuals like Jane Goodall and others, I learned, that humility and sacrifice, dedication to others was really the mode of operandi that they lived by. And, that sense of humility, always putting yourself last, seeking the benefit of others way before yourself, was most important to these individuals. This is the chief of the Sioux Nations, Chief Arvol, who is a sacred chief that you may have heard about because he ended up going to Iraq because he had, prior to the Gulf War, had this dream that it was going to erupt in black smoke. So he went out with a couple of the elders and to try to preach peace and to try to cut off this particular issue from happening. And as soon as Saddam Hussein realized he was in the country, he ended up putting them under house arrest. And it was actually Muhammad Ali that came into the country and got their freedom, that got their freedom back into the United States. So, all of these individuals that I've come across, these are some of the presidents that I've photographed through the years. I would say that, when you kind of look deeper into the aspect of humility, and I would say with the politicians, and, all of us are human and some lack more humility than others. But, from a business perspective, I think that humility can be defined in a lot of different ways. And when you go deeper, it should be that nothing is too small that you wouldn't do yourself, and putting people above yourself. I would say that, in terms of running companies, running businesses, you oftentimes, in taking more of a humble approach, to speak as little as possible about yourself and to lift other people up, not to try to get involved with other people's personal business. In other words, trying to fend off any kind of sense of curiosity about others. I think that, passing over the mistakes as much as you can of other people, unless it's constructive in terms of coming back to them. These are all things that I learned from a lot of these Nobel Peace Laureates and many of the leaders who are really brought up in our world as being esteemed, like Nelson Mandela and, of course, Mother Teresa herself. Never to stand on your own kind of laurels, to be able to put other people before yourself. And I would say that, when you look at business in general, that's something that is really lacking in these days. And, we don't see so much of that, being able to, put people before profit. And as we all know, people are very expendable in today's workforce. But to be able to kind of, spread that compassionate care around the office. And, I remember this quote that Mother Teresa oftentimes told me. She said, "Never strive to be successful, strive to be faithful." Now, she may have said that because she knew I needed to hear that, but I think that is a lesson that we all need to be repeated. This, of course, Gorbachev and his wife, Raisa. And I would say that, spending time with Gorbachev was really interesting because he was quite a charismatic individual. I saw him break down and cry with a war hero that had been maimed in a bomb injury. And I also saw him walk out of a particular meeting just because of being provoked by an individual. So, many of these individuals have very complex characters, but I think to be able to look at the small things and to have that resourcefulness, that discipline of being able to realize that you're in a business that involves people, made by people, and to be able to always seek out the benefit of others first. This is Louis Zamperini, who it was the focus of the book Unbroken. Neil Armstrong, who is the first man on the moon. This is a very rare picture of Neil prior to I think, the 50th anniversary of the moon landing. And he died a few years after this photograph was taken. I remember asking Neil what was the scariest part of this particular mission. And he said the scariest part for him was realizing that Buzz had the only key to get back into the lunar module after being on the moon surface. And he was just a fascinating guy to be around, incredibly humble, didn't want to be known for one piece of fireworks in his workload, but really the ledger of all of his work throughout the years. He was a very humble guy who thought that the first man on the moon was really a matter of circumstance. It wasn't anything that he did or he accomplished personally that got him there. This is, of course, Malala, who was shot in advocating children's rights to be able to go to school and to have an education. She was shot through the cheekbone, actually shot through the brain that went out through the cheek, and she's paralyzed on the side, has no hearing on her left ear, and has no kind of vengefulness or retribution to her killer, her assailant. This is Norman Borlaug, the Nobel Peace Laureate, who is credited with saving 500 million people from starvation by coming up with the wheat and corn production. It was a genetically altered wheat and corn production that saved that amount of individuals from famine in Africa and India. He always thought that somebody would be able to come after him to be able to find a better way for the soil and for our food source. But it's very hard to imagine that being able to, in today's world, saving that many lives. This is Vandana Shiva, who would be sort of the opposite viewpoint of Norman Borlaug, who believes in just organic farming. So I feel it's very important to, document these individuals who have a lot to say for us. The Dalai Lama had told me that his religion is just of kindness, and that we always have the opportunity to be kind to other people. Nelson Mandela, I spent 3 days around the clock with, and I think that he wasn't, a fan, for example, of rugby, and he really wanted to find out who were his enemies in South Africa, who are the ones that wanted the blacks to be killed and separated from society, and he wanted to get to know them while he was spending 27 years in prison on Robben Island. And he ended up, because he was a lawyer and had that knowledge to represent a lot of these individuals on their cases, his jailers who were facing jail terms because they had killed other Black brothers and sisters of Mandela. And he spent 27 years in an 8 by 10-foot cell, and had no kind of vengefulness also with his jailers. In fact, when he became president of South Africa, who he had seated next to him was his jailer from Robben Island. I remember asking him, how was he able to survive all of those years? And I think that he learned the language of Afrikaans, which was the language of divided South Africa at the time, just to be able to learn how his enemies thought and to become friends with them. And he was a student of Gandhi and Martin Luther King, and that really helped him throughout his time in jail. He went into jail as a father of babies and came out as a great-grandfather. And I asked him about that, and he said, in prison I learned to love my enemies, because in loving my enemies, it ruins their reputation. Maya Angelou, I used to spend many Thanksgiving dinner at her home in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And she's very famous for saying, people will forget what you did and they'll forget what you said, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And that's another aspect that we can carry on in our lives with our interaction with each other. Mother Teresa was probably one of the great individuals that I had the opportunity to spend 15 years with. And I was with her in India and various parts around the world. And she was always the same with each person that she encountered, always trying to see the face of God in each person that she was with. She was never looking beyond you and at the other person and feeling like, you know, looking at her clock, thinking that, you know, I need to get on with my work. She said, I can only serve one person at a time. I can only love one person at a time. So that's how she went about her work, one by one, which is another thing that I think that we can all take into consideration. It was very interesting to see her at work. I remember being in the car with her, and we would go to various places that she had meetings on a particular day. And I was amazed at just the amount of just reaction to Mother Teresa. People would come up and want to kiss her feet or hug her or pour out their innermost confessions to her. And when we got back in the car, I questioned her about that. And I said, Mother, you never seem to judge anybody. And she said very quickly back to me, she said, I never judge anybody because it doesn't allow me the time to love them. And that's how she went about doing her work. This is the nuns very early in the morning at 6:30 in the morning, washing their saris. They had 2 water pumps that would provide water for cooking and washing for 100 sisters. There was nothing too small that Mother Teresa wouldn't do herself. In all our businesses, you know, we rely on other people. She would always take the most difficult task and set an example that way. And this was an individual that I met who was dying in one of her houses in Calcutta called Nirmal Hriday, which translates basically to the house of dying. He had tuberculosis, but by the time that the sisters had found him on the street and Mother took him in, he was really in the last hours. And you can see in the face of this man, this is the same individual, how just a simple caress by this co-worker from Germany that had come to work with Mother Teresa and learned by her, how he lit up. And 2 hours later, he was gone. He had passed away. So it was remarkable for me to see the small things. It was always about the amount of love we put into the small things that mattered. You know, Mother Teresa was never concerned about trying to pull off miracles and unkindness, but to do small things with great love. So it was a treasure to work with her and to learn by her. I was involved with her official sainthood portrait, which was one of the great honors of my career. This is how that appeared on the Basilica of St. Peter's in front of about 150,000 individuals. So I've gone about my work, you know, documenting a wide variety of individuals. The Pope ended up at the end of that day of canonization, posting the picture out because he had actually bought about 2,000 pizzas to feed the homeless in Rome in adoration to Mother Teresa on that particular day of sainthood. This is Greg Boyle, who just won the Medal of Freedom, just was awarded the Medal of Freedom. And he runs an organization called Homeboy Industries. And I'll just sort of end with these individuals that he serves. So basically, he serves a lot of these gang kids that are coming out of prison, trying to reform them, getting them work. He has never met an individual that was a bad person, that couldn't be redeemed, according to Greg Boyle. And it's his thinking that if more of us stand in solidarity with those on the margins, that the margins would be erased. This is Greg in his office. This gives you a little bit of a picture of some of the individuals that are under his care. He has tattoo removal in his particular Homeboy Industries, and then places them in various social entrepreneurships that they have under the umbrella of Homeboy Industries, such as a bakery. They have several businesses that are quite successful. But you can see these individuals. This is one of the friends that I met who was a member of MI6, came out of jail, and this is the same man with almost all of his tattoos removed. This is another individual that I got to know quite well, Johanna. who was crying on this particular day because she told me that this was her child being baptized by Greg. She told me that she couldn't get a job and she couldn't understand why she couldn't get a job. And this is her now. She's had that painful procedure of losing all of the tattoos in her face. And she now just graduated with a law degree from UCLA and wants to become a lawyer. So super proud of her and the work. This is a famous actor who was under the care of Homeboy Industries, got his start in acting as a result of sort of being reformed and refined under Greg Boyle. And he just feels that, you know, we have to realize that we're all part of one family, the human family, a family that's there were no outsiders. Everybody is included, everybody is involved. And a lot of these issues, I think that we can put into our own lives and be able to reach out, especially to those who are most vulnerable, people that we know, as Mother Teresa would say, in our own family. You know, start with the poor in our own family and work out into our community and make a difference. And again, Mother Teresa had never felt that she was making any grand difference. She said that what she did was she was a pencil in God's hands and was able to maybe put one drop in the ocean, but without that drop, it was one less significant drop. So I'll end there and I'll leave it open. I don't know how we're doing on time, Rushton, but I'll leave it open for any kind of questions you may have. And it's a little hard for me to compress a lot of what I have into a few minutes, but happy to entertain whatever questions you might have.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I'm excited for us to have the chance to ask you a little bit about these incredible experiences that you've had, and I invite the different people who are part of the recording today to add your questions to the chat, and I can read them, or you can say I have a question, and we'll pass it over to you. I'll start the questions, and I'm particularly interested in in part of your artistic choice. So many of your pictures are black and white. Can you talk a little bit about what it means to be photographing people in black and white to you?
Well, thanks for that question, Rushton. I think a lot of that comes back to my time with Richard Avedon, with Ansel Adams. For me, black and white strips away the distractions of color. And what I'm after as a photographer, and I love the opportunity to be one-on-one with an individual. I do journalistic work as well, but my real love is to be sitting down across the table from an individual and to try to pull out or to draw out some sort of real emotion or some sort of real characteristic of that individual. I would never sit with you and take your picture and ask you to smile or to say cheese, or I would want that to be a very real dialogue. And what I learned early in my career is, regardless of whether you're shy or outgoing, I was pretty shy in those years, and it took me a while to feel confident, to sort of lose the jitters and being afraid and nervous in front of well-known people such as Sinatra. I always thought that I'd be dumped in the bay with cement shoes if I had a bad picture of him. But I think what I'm always after is to have a real kind of dialogue and to seek out a picture that is in some ways, in my view, heroic. I never feel that I've attained that, or very rarely. It probably goes back to thinking of my most successful pictures being something that I pre-visualized. But I believe if I had the opportunity, I would always shoot in black and white, because black and white, I think, is the true art form. And as I said, it strips away any kind of distractions you might have. Now, again, color may lend itself in many ways to a particular picture, but it also can be very distracting when you're trying to bring across an emotion.
So, in thinking about the desire to find an emotion in your setting, in your subject, how much of it is the conversation, the observation? How much of it is preparation that you do ahead of spending time with someone whose portrait you're going to take? Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, I always tell people that being a good photographer is really less about, the technical aspect of it. It's really being a good psychologist. And certainly a lot of my subjects are famous, so I get the opportunity to investigate, conversations so that I can sort of dictate the conversation that I want to have with that individual to bring out certain emotions. Maybe you want them laughing, maybe you want them serious. I mean, the key would be getting a range of emotions. But I have a lot of opportunity to study them. And I would say that one thing that I'm aware of is that I have an acutely inane sense of detail in terms of studying very quickly an individual's face. Now, and every face has a thinner side and a heavier side, a smaller eye and a bigger eye. And, I'm aware of all those details. So that plays into how I use the light, but which oftentimes I'll light the subject myself because I like to have that control. But in terms of having that inane sense of detail, I also am very aware psychologically of a person's sort of, swagger, personality, mood swing. You pick up on a lot of those different things. It's very important to take your particular predisposed egos or feelings about the individual out of the equation to start with, and to be very open to what might happen in that exchange, because I have a particular idea of how I want to photograph this individual, and they certainly probably have an idea of how they want to be portrayed. And let's face it, most people don't like being photographed. I don't like being photographed myself. So, I understand that aspect very well too. So I would say that most of it really comes down to being in tune with the psychological exchange between a sitter and a subject, and being able to, move that equation in different ways in that conversation in ways where they feel more relaxed and comfortable. There was a time where I was photographing Al Pacino and Robert De Niro in New York, and um, they were quite difficult to photograph. And just getting them to look in the camera was just a challenge, and getting them to be relaxed and look. And you wouldn't think that being in front of the movie screens, but I would say that I took the I always have the camera on a tripod typically so that I can be face to face with the individual, because I think that's very important to have eye contact and not to be behind the camera. So I had a long cable release and I moved the camera over so that we could be face to face. And then I was able to see where my lighting was, and then just had this conversation with both of them. And that was the difference in capturing, a range of emotions with those two individuals. So, you encounter people in this life who are outgoing and shy and reserved and self-conscious about their weight, their nose, their face, their hair, lack of hair. So, you come up against all of those situations as well. So I think being able to easily navigate and pivot those situations in ways that make them feel comfortable. And again, that goes back to knowing your equipment, knowing where the light is, and most importantly, having that exchange that is real and something that really tries to capture the dignity of each person.
Well, there's any number of questions I could ask in terms of photography, but I think I'll save a lot of those until after the recording. What I'd like to ask is that you and I share a connection to a school, to Sarah High School. You got your art education at St. Mary's. Are there moments in your educational journey that essentially prepared you to be someone who could listen to the kinds of things that people might say, that allow you to shape an experience with them? So so many of the quotes you shared were so moving, a pencil in the hand of God, right? What are moments in your education that stand out as moments that were important for preparing you for the work you've done?
Well, just in terms of Sarah High School, I would say that fully prepared me as a young person, molded me, exposed me to a wide variety of other individuals who are like-minded. The teachers really were quite inspiring, bringing about individuals such as Mother Teresa that I was completely unaware of, but began getting captivated by. I was always a student and had an interest in historic individuals and individuals of accomplishment. And I would say that that was something through my education that really was molded, at Sarah, at St. Mary's, um, through wonderful, inspiring teachers such as yourself, who really, have a long list of individuals who have been impacted by your style of teaching and being able to inspire young people. And to this day, I really see it as such an opportunity to also teach with what I've learned from a lot of these individuals, these 41 Nobel Peace Laureates, these 7 presidents and countless other heads of state who have accomplished something. To be able to lift up somebody like a civil rights hero like John Lewis or Coretta King or Clarence Jones, who was King's speechwriter and lawyer. These are individuals, Nelson Mandela, that should not be lost in history books. They should be present and should be learned by. None of these individuals were saints from that perspective, with the exception of maybe Mother Teresa and a few select others. But most of them aren't, and, had major human frailties. But yet to be able to identify with those individuals because of the human frailties. That's something that probably we all connect with. We all identify with the fact that we're not perfect and we're sinners and we've made mistakes and we've failed. All these individuals that have accomplished something were great failures too. And to be able to learn through that sense of humility, and also that boundless dedication to the goals that they had in life, their particular vocation that led them to achievement, is something to be shared and celebrated.
As a final question before we finish the recording, I'll take one that's come through the chat from Shags. Tell us a little bit about the books you've written. When you think about these books, obviously a lot of them are collections of your photography, but in writing the different books you've written, what are the themes that for you are the ones that you're kind of most excited to be able to share?
Well, I would say it goes back to my second book. Well, the first book I did was with Mother Teresa, which was called Works of Love or Works of Peace. And she rarely get permission to authorize a book that she would be involved with, let alone a book on her and her work with her sisters. So she was my first entree into working on a book. The one that really I always go back to is Architects of Peace. There's a collection of individuals that I went about documenting prior to the millennium, prior to the year 2000. And I went about traveling for, I think it was about 8 years prior to the millennium, wanting to collect a lot of these voices in the world that were doing good work and bringing us forward into the millennium with their particular essays as to what is their prescription for the present time and for the future. And I was able to get 75 very well-known individuals in the world, such as Mandela and the Dalai Lama and countless others, to write an essay on peace or on their particular work and where we need to be today. Gorbachev wrote about nuclear non-proliferation. A lot of these essays hold up to today. And after 2000, the book was quite celebrated. In fact, it was one of the top books by USA Today. It received a lot of attention at the time, but I realized when 9/11 happened in 2001 that I had the email list of a lot of these individuals, the Nobel Peace Laureates at the time, many of these leaders that were in office or recently out of office at that time. And I basically went back to them thinking that maybe I can get them all to write an op-ed piece in the New York Times that would be sort of a nonviolent or a better way of going about responding to 9/11 and leaving it completely in their hands. And I couldn't get all of them to agree with each other. So what we decided to do, myself and my friend Mary Wald, who runs the community.com, she was a great web master and was able to devise a website that made this exchange between these individuals like Gorbachev and Mandela and the Dalai Lama, where people could respond to what they've written and then they could respond back. And I know in the case of Shimon Peres and the Dalai Lama, and particularly Gorbachev, loved that exchange. It broke down in the first week that we actually put it up because we weren't expecting the flood of people to crash the site. But then we were able to fix that, and it's now, I think, a part of the Library of Congress on 9/11. So I realized that it had an impact with people, and that's what led me to go further and document the Nobel Peace Prize winners. I can't always say that the Nobel Peace Prize has been given to, the most appropriate individual. I think it's sometimes very controversial. However, it's really the prize that's held up in society worldwide, probably the most prestigious prize. So I spent a lot of years documenting that and just traveling the world as I still do, documenting individuals who are trying to change the world, whether they be social entrepreneurs or peacemakers or human rights activists.
Well,
So I would say those two are probably the most important for me.
that makes sense. I have to ask one more question.
Sure.
You mentioned that you convinced Mother Teresa to work with you on a book. You convinced Ansel Adams to take you in and teach you something about photography. Clearly, persistence is not something that you're without. As you think about the things you've learned and the people who might be out there working to make a difference in the lives of others, is there a piece of advice from somebody that you have encountered or that you've thought of on your own that you feel is especially important to share?
Well, I think the immediate thing that comes up for me would be something that Mother Teresa had told me many times, in saying, never allow anybody who comes to you to leave without being better for having been in your presence. And in her way, seeing the face of God in your eyes and in your smile, but to really have an impact in people's lives, to be able to make a difference in people's lives. So that's one thing that I would say that I try to live with on a daily basis.
Well, I believe I just asked you the question we always ask people at the end, which is what finishing thought would you have for an audience? We'll wind things down, and what I'd like to tell everyone who has joined us for this recording, thank you for spending your time with us. That hope that you have when you come to the recordings that we do, that you will learn something that will inspire you. It will give you the opportunity to see how you might be of service to others, that you might recognize that there are groups of people like Rotarians, like teachers, like the people who work with the people on the margins, who are making a difference every single day. And I hope that in doing so, you might share this recording, this podcast, this video with others who might be in need of inspiration as well. It is part of what we do as the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley. With that, I'd like to thank you for being part of our recordings. Michael, thank you so much for joining us for this. And everyone, we will see you next week.
Thank you very much, Rushton.